Good evening. My name is Jeanette Gabriel. I'm the director of the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm very pleased that you've joined us this evening for our program with Dr. Adam Teller, Rescue the Surviving Souls, the Great Jewish Refugee Crisis of the 17th Century. Before I introduce Dr. Teller, I want to mention that this is part of a series that the Schwalb Center is holding this fall, examining new research work in Jewish migration. So stay tuned. We will be having several programs on the topic throughout the fall and winter. For more information on regular monthly programming held at the Schwalb Center, you can see our website and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Moving right along then, we're very pleased to have Dr. Teller with us tonight. Dr. Teller is a professor of history and Judaic Studies at Brown University and will be speaking on his new book, Rescue the Surviving Souls, the Great Jewish Refugee Crisis of the 17th Century. Dr. Teller was born and raised in London and attended Oxford University. He then moved to Israel and completed his graduate studies in Polish and Lithuanian Jewry at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Teller joined the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa in 1995 and remained there until 2010 when he moved to Providence, Rhode Island to take up his current position as Professor of History and Judaic Studies at Brown University. We're very pleased to have him here with us tonight discussing the first manuscript on this important topic of the Jewish refugee crisis resulting from the Polish-Lithuanian War. I want to mention that as part of this event, Princeton University Press is offering a special discount on purchase of Rescuing the Surviving Souls. From now through November 15th, you can receive 30% off the purchase of the book plus free shipping. And for everyone who has registered for this event, you will receive a follow-up email with detailed information on that offer to purchase Dr. Teller's book if you have not already done so. The format of this webinar will be that Dr. Teller will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A. For those of you who submitted questions in advance, Dr. Teller will address those issues throughout his presentation. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Teller. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me there? It's okay? Right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and thank you very much to the Schwalb Center for inviting me. This is really a wonderful project that they're doing on the history of Jewish migration. It's a really crucial topic. And I'm really delighted to be able to talk in that framework. So now I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's hope this works. Yes, yes, good. Okay, so what's the book about? Well, broadly speaking, and I'll go into some detail in a moment, there's a huge wave of pogroms in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, which is one of the major settlements of Jewish life in the 17th century. And thousands upon thousands of Jews are killed. And that's been heavily researched. A lot of ink has been spilt on those massacres. Much less ink, in fact, virtually no ink, has been spilt on the fate of the survivors. Many of the Jews who were caught up in that war fled their homes. Some fled within Ukraine to other towns. Some fled within Poland. And some were captured and taken as slaves to Istanbul, where they were ransomed, and we'll talk about that. There follow other wars. In Poland, and then we see Jews, sort of refugees spreading across the world. It's a really huge phenomenon. And it's one that no one knew about. In fact, I didn't know about it. When I started doing work, I wanted to do a little project on ransoming captives in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I knew the Polish Jews had come there after 1648, so I thought, I'll take a look and see what there is. The more work I did, the more I discovered that there was almost no community in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then in Poland, and then in Central Europe, the German lands, that didn't talk about the arrival of Jewish refugees in 1648. And it was, you know, the more I looked, the more I found, and the clearer it became that we're not looking at something small at all. We're looking at this huge movement of Jews to various different places that creates a new shape to the Jewish world. The other thing I enjoyed particularly doing this work was the sources. There's no block of sources. Historians like to have a block of sources and you work through it. It isn't how it was. I had to go from one small source to another small source by historical detective work, which is fun, but takes a long time. But what I found were a relatively large number of first-hand sources of people who'd been refugees, either rabbis, right, who'd fled in their youth, and then when they got to their new homes, wrote books, and in the introduction to their books, they always had a section about their experiences as refugees. And they wrote so vividly as if it was sort of alive in their heads. The other thing I found, which was also wonderful, were depositions in courts, particularly in cases where women had lost their husbands and had to prove that they were widows. And here we have first-hand evidence given not just by men, but by women, right? Explaining what had happened to them when they'd last seen their husband and their husband had been found. And this is more first-hand evidence, right, of what the experience of being a refugee. And so I was able to write this book and focus on what it actually meant to be a refugee, to move from place to place. And then I used the material to look at what happened when they reached the different places, how they were received and what that meant. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. I'll try and do it in 40 minutes if I can. Hopefully not too much longer than that. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so what are we talking about? Okay, so the region of Europe we're going to start in is Eastern Europe, this region here, which in the period we're talking about was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was made up of a big Polish state and a Lithuanian state that were united into one huge country. And in this period, it's a big and major country in Eastern Europe and includes this region of Ukraine. So the Jews from Ukraine flee northwards and westwards into Poland. Some of them are taken as slaves to the Crimea and then sold in Istanbul. And later on, we'll see that more Jews flee either to Hamburg and Amsterdam by sea or just by land to Eastern Europe. And they spread out across the Jewish world. So it's actually, I mean, I have refugees in Jerusalem and in Cairo. We even have fundraising in Fez in Morocco. It's a very, very broad phenomenon. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. And let's sort of try and get a little bit of background. Okay. The Jews in Eastern Europe made their money because they were the economic agents of the nobility. And what's particularly interesting to us is that they did this to a very great extent in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine had been occupied by Poland in about 100 years previously. And Poland began to squeeze the Ukrainian economy to get rich. Ukraine was very good agricultural land, and you could grow a lot of corn and you could sell it, and particularly you could export it and get very rich. And so the Polish nobility and some Ukrainian nobles who became Polonized and Catholicized began to rule over Ukraine. They turned it into these huge feudal estates where the peasants, right, their subjects were Ukrainian, and they began to squeeze them. They squeezed them economically. And of course, there's religious tension between Catholic nobles and Orthodox peasants. In the middle of that are the Jews, because many of the nobles don't actually want to manage their estates. They want to sit, you know, with the king in Warsaw. They don't want to be engaged in that. And so they lease out their estates to Jews. It's a kind of form of money lending. The Jews will lease the estate to give the money up front. Then they become de facto estate owners, like noblemen, and run the estates for the noblemen. And any money they make beyond what they've paid, that's their profit. Now, of course, that sets up a whole new range of tensions in Ukraine, right? Because the peasants, they're not only angry at being occupied by Poland and ruled by a Polonized Catholic nobility, now they've got Jews running this show. right? And in Christian Europe, right, being ruled by a Jew is probably the most humiliating thing you can imagine. And so Ukraine becomes this powder keg of economic, social, ethnic, and religious tensions. What turns it into an uprising is this figure here on the left, a man called Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He was the head of the Cossacks. He was the Cossack hetman or general. Right? And the Cossacks' job was to protect Ukraine from invasion from the east, from Crimea. Go back a little. Here's Crimea here. Crimea was an area settled by Tatars. It's Muslims who were vassals of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, and they made their living by capturing slaves in this whole region, the north of the Black Sea. So it was Khmelnytsky's job to keep them at bay. Right? This was a huge slaving business that people haven't researched properly. In fact, in this period, it's as big as the Atlantic slavery. Later on, Atlantic slavery grows and this stops. But in this period, it's a really major slaving business. So Khmelnytsky has his own units. They have troubles with pay and conditions from the Polish government, and so they mount a little rebellion. Khmelnytsky decides he's going to have his soldiers revolt and try and demand more money. He's a smart guy, so he does a deal with his erstwhile enemy, Islam Giray III, the Tatar Khan, and they invade Poland. This is where the story starts. They invade Poland. They're not terribly interested in Jews. I mean, they hate the Jews, but that's not what they're really interested in. They're interested in terms and conditions for the army. However, as they invade, they're the red arrows here. As they're invading, the king of Poland dies. And since Poland is an elected monarchy, all the nobles go back to Warsaw to elect a new king. And that leaves the field open for Khmelnytsky's soldiers. And when that happens, the peasants rise. And this turns into a huge popular revolt in Ukraine. And the peasants are very angry at the Jews. And so we see a series of massacres of Jews. The peasants move from town to town to town. Right? Each time the towns can't stand up to the force because there are sort of tens, hundreds of thousands of peasants. And in each place, the Jews are massacred. Right? And by the time the first couple of years have gone past, according to research, probably a third of the Jewish population of Ukraine has been killed. I'm going to say that it's not hundreds of thousands of Jews because there weren't hundreds of thousands of Jews there in the first place. It's perhaps 18, 20,000, but it's about a third of the population. They die. Many of these Jews, of course, flee. They flee ahead of the army. As their town is besieged, they flee to the next town. And then as the next town is besieged, they flee to another town, right? And they're fleeing ahead of the army, trying to avoid being killed. This revolt lasts until about 1654. Then Poland quietens down Ukraine. But then two other armies invade. They think Poland is now weak enough and they can invade. You have the Russian army coming in from the east, that's these yellow arrows, and you have the Swedish army coming in from the north, that's the blue. So Poland is in fact fighting wars from 1648. The Swedish war ends in 1660, the Russian war in 1667. So it's like 20 years of wars. Now the Jews are not always the main targets for the Russians and the Swedes, but they are always targets. And when Poland is fighting back, they are major targets for the Polish resistance. And so here too, you have massacres of Jews and you have Jews fleeing. But this is a picture not actually from Ukraine, it's a picture from Vienna, but it gives a sense of sort of Jews fleeing a city, and that's how it would have looked. I have a first-hand testimony from Ukraine. This is a man called Nathan Hanover. He wrote, "So everyone fled. Anyone who had a horse and cart took that. Those who did not have one, even though they had enough money to buy one, would not wait, but took their wives and children by hand and fled on foot, throwing away all their belongings. There was a column, 3 horse and carts wide on the road for a stretch of 7 miles. Then he says, 3 mounted men, 1 Jew and two noblemen chased after us, saying, "Why are you going so slowly? The enemy is close on our heels." Immediately, indescribable panic and confusion seized the Jews. Everyone threw silver, gold, utensils, books, pillows, and bed covers from their carts so they could get away more quickly. The field was cluttered with gold, silver, and clothes, but no Jew stopped to take them. Some left everything behind, including the horse and cart, and fled for their lives into the woods with their wives and children. Many women and men who had taken their children by the hand let go of them in the panic. So this is indescribable terror, and it's a really amazing flight. These Jews flee, as I say, within Ukraine and then within Poland going north. Other Jews from the Russian invasion will flee north and then take ships to Hamburg and Amsterdam, and from the Swedish invasion, they would just go north, they go west into Germany. I'm only going to look at two groups of those three because I haven't got enough time. I haven't got enough time to talk about those two, but I'll try and squeeze them in. That's the internal refugees who flee north, and then the refugees who are taken as captives and sold in Istanbul. So let's start moving. Okay. So this is a map of the major Jewish communities in Lithuania in the period we're talking about. The Jews are coming up from Ukraine, coming from the south, northward from Ukraine, to the communities, the red communities here. Actually, I have a great story of a Jew here in this town of Schlusk. He's writing when he's an old man, as a rabbi, but when he says, "I came to Schlusk as a refugee when I was a young boy. And in the evening, I used to take my Gemara onto the roof and practice, study for tomorrow. But as I was sitting there, I would burst into tears and call out to God and bang my head on the wall." Right? It's kind of traumatized kid who's struggling to make sense of what's happened to him. What do the Jews in Lithuania do as thousands of Jews from Ukraine begin to flee northwards? Well, they have their own council. There's a Jewish Council of Lithuania, and we have its records. So we know what it did. We know how it organized to help the Jews as they fled northwards. Right? These are Jews who are destitute. They have nothing. Like they are genuine refugees. The first thing it does is it gives a certain amount of financial help. If the Jews are coming and they need to be ransomed or there's some problem, the council promises to give some money, which is really quite remarkable in and of itself. The other order it gives is that it orders the communities to take in refugees, which is really important. Because once the community takes in refugees, they become part of the community's responsibility. They become the poor of the town, and so they need to be helped. And so all the communities, and it's done by a key of size. The bigger you are, the more refugees you're supposed to take in. As the refugees kept on coming, this became a greater financial burden. The council ran out of money, so it wasn't helping. And then we see the communities actually writing to the council and saying, "Look, we haven't got enough money. We're going to close the yeshiva. We're not going to have a Torah academy in town. It's too expensive. We've got to look after the refugees." Of course, the council doesn't allow that at all. You can't stop studying Torah even in this kind of a crisis. But it's a sign of the economic tensions that develop. The next thing the council does, as it becomes clear that there are too many refugees, it decides to send guards to the south of Lithuania here to stop the refugees coming. They want us, I don't think they want to build a border wall, but they want to stop the inflow of refugees if they can, because Lithuania is really struggling to contain them. That doesn't work either, right? And you have thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian Jewish refugees flooding the communities of Lithuania. And the council, right, can do some basic things, but it really can't help. The help will come at the local level. And I have records from this town here called Schwalb, and they're very, very revealing of how a community deals with an influx of refugees. The first thing that becomes clear, right, is the refugees aren't put in any kind of a camp, right? They're not huddled together outside town in some place. They are brought into town and they are put in the homes of the local Jews. Right? The local Jews of Schwalb literally open their doors to the refugees and keep them, look after them. How do we know this? Because the non-Jews, right, who are not interested in having Jews in town at all, get very upset. And we have records of them saying, you know, the Jewish houses are now packed with Jews. There are more Jews than we wanted to have here. We've got to stop this. But of course, the Jews are very expert at getting their own way anyway. The next thing we see is that these Jews are allowed to trade in town. That's also very rare. Normally, trading in each community is for members only. Strangers can't trade. Not now. These strangers are given trading rights. I mean, mostly it's petty trade. They're peddling, right? You know, or they're trying to do whatever business they can, right? But once again, they're not, I mean, they are receiving a certain amount of philanthropy, but really they're being told to get on and work and, you know, look after themselves. Jewish women are active in this as well. We have particular complaints from the town council about Jewish women selling baked goods. Right? So presumably that's, you know, that is a transferable skill, like being able to bake. So Jewish women would bake bread or cake or whatever it was, go out on the streets and sell it to make some money. So this is not just the men fighting and dealing with the problem, this is the refugee women as well taking responsibility. That too annoys the non-Jews, right? They don't want all this trade, they see this as competition and they're very hostile. In fact, they try to expel, first of all, they try to expel the refugees and then they try to expel all the Jews. The Jews are smart enough to deal with it. So some of the Jews leave and then they come back. But what's happening essentially is that this community is opening its doors. It's letting the refugees in. It's making them part of life in town. Even at the cost of, you know, great tensions with the non-Jewish authorities. This continues until the mid-60s, by which stage sort of the wars are now quiet. Even the Russian war is right at its end. Some of the Jews have gone back. Some of the Jews have remained. The council has a kind of mini census of refugees who've settled because they need to be taxed, right? So we can see that, in fact, the demographic structure of Lithuanian Jewry has changed. Following this, the refugees have changed the way in which the structure of Lithuanian Jewry. Taking a slightly longer view, and I've talked about all the pressures and the tensions and the struggle to look after this. If you take a view from the late 60s, this seems to have been quite a successful policy, right? Because the problem goes away. You don't hear discussions of what to do with refugees, what to do with, you know, the paupers from Ukraine or the paupers from the East, nothing. It seems to be that the Jews of Lithuania have, over time, right, managed to deal with the problem. And I think that is a really important phenomenon because it shows that in even times of crisis, Jewish communities were able to organize together. They had the ways and the means to deal with the problem. It may have taken a few years, but the problem was dealt with. Okay, so now we'll look at the second group of Jews that I want to look at here. And that is the Jews who were captured by the Tatars. Remember, the Tatars are the slaving group from here in the Crimea. They're captured in Ukraine, right? And they are marched to the Dnieper River, and they're then sort of taken down the Dnieper to Crimea, where they are divided up, and some of them are resold, and then they are shipped to Istanbul. I mean, this is a wonderful piece of cartography. You don't see cartography like this every day. But this, that is basically the route that they took. Got some pictures to show you, not specifically about what we're talking about, but close. No, not that one, this one. So here's a picture from the 17th century of Tatars shipping captives down the Dnieper River. What you can see here is a sort of women. It's interesting, and it's also in the Jewish material. The Tatars, when they sort of were slaving, they had to capture slaves who would be able to survive the journey. Right? It was a journey of 10 days or so from Ukraine to Istanbul. You had to go on foot, you had to go in ships, you were sold in Crimea, you were shipped again, another forced march to Istanbul. So if you were old or not very strong, you're very likely to die on the way. And it just wasn't worth the Tatars' while to capture people like that. So they just killed them on the spot. What also seems to be the case is that women, there were higher profit margins dealing with women captives than with male captives. So even amongst the slightly younger people, Jews, the ones who were going to be taken, there was a preference for women. And in fact, I have a wonderful testimony from a court actually in Istanbul of a man who's telling the story of how he was separated from his father. But he says that when the Tatars came, there was an order to kill all the men and only take the women. He said, but I was lucky. My beard wasn't showing. And so they put a dress on me and the women took me, and that's how I survived. It's really, remarkable. There are lots of remarkable stories like that. It's an amazing time, and there are amazing sources. Being a captive and being sold as a slave was not a joke. I've got two pictures here of a 17th century slaving, sadly not from Istanbul, but from Algiers. But I don't imagine it was terribly different. So this is a slave market where you have the slaves being presented. This is how the slaves were being treated on their way to the market. It was no joke being a captive and a slave. Right? We know this from American history. These slaves, to a very great extent, weren't plantation slaves like we're used to in America. Some went to work on plantations. Most famously, Captain John Smith, who was of Pocahontas fame, he was captured and sold as a slave in the Ottoman Empire. He actually did work on a plantation. But you could be taken to work in a town, you could be taken to work in a household. Women, of course, were taken as servants and as sex slaves. And it was, if you got caught as a slave, right, your life changed. What you had before, right, was lost, and you had to be thinking about a new kind of life. That was for most people. For Jews, however, it was slightly different. The same chronicle I read from has another really interesting story about Jews being captured by Tatars to be sent to Istanbul for sale. And they call out for mercy from the Tatars. And the Tatars answer them and say to them, look, you've been captured. We're going to take you to Istanbul. But if you have food, collect food here to take with you, kosher food. And you should know that when you get to Istanbul, your brothers there will redeem you. They will redeem you as captives. And so the Jews being taken to Istanbul actually sort of had a little bit of hope at the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe when we get to Istanbul, we can be redeemed. Why is that happening? It's happening because among the kinds of philanthropy that Jews are commanded to do, right, in the Torah, right, in the mitzvot, you have local philanthropy, Aniyei Ircha, the poor people of your town, and then you have Pidyon Shvuim. Any Jew who has been arrested or captured, right, it is incumbent upon the Jews where that person is to redeem them, presumably so that they won't be forced to convert to another religion. They won't be lost to the Jewish people. They have to be redeemed. That is called in Hebrew, Pidyon Shvuim, the redemption of captives. Now, the Jews who were coming from Poland were actually coming at a good time for Pidyon Shvuim, if there's ever a good time for Pidyon Shvuim, right? Because this whole region of the Eastern Mediterranean was a region that was suffering from captivity. This was a region, right, of many, many Sephardic Jewish communities who were great traders. They had trading networks, maritime trading networks. So you have them on the Italian Peninsula, Greece, which is part of the Ottoman Empire, the Holy Land, North Africa. They are prey to pirates. The Eastern Mediterranean is full of pirates, most particularly, for our story, the Knights of St. John on Malta. And they make their living by capturing ships, taking the goods and the people back to Malta, and then selling them there as slaves. And so all of the Sephardic communities around the Eastern Mediterranean, and one or two further north, Hamburg and Amsterdam, Sephardic communities, right, are organized together to ransom these captives. They've put together a ransoming network that collects money from all of the towns marked here, perhaps not Akko and Al-Basra, but from the other places, right? They're collecting money in order that they can go and ransom the slaves, particularly on Malta. Right? It's spearheaded by two rabbis in Venice, Shmuel Aboab and Moshe Zakuto. They're the great fundraisers, but they're in connection, letters to all of these places, raising money. And every time a new shipment of Jewish slaves come to Malta, letters go out, money is sent, and the Jews are redeemed. Not always immediately, it could take years, but it was done. So when our Polish Jews arrived in Istanbul, right, they were coming to a place that understood the importance of Pidyon Shvim, for whom Pidyon Shvim was a major mitzvah that needed to be kept. Maimonides, the Rambam, says it's a mitzvah rabbi. It's a major mitzvah, possibly the most important philanthropic mitzvah that there is, to ransom captives. And so, right, the Jews of Istanbul, which is a major Jewish community, possibly the biggest in the world at this period, very wealthy, very dignified, a very important place. They begin to organize to ransom these thousands of Polish Jews who are coming. And it's important to notice that this is Sephardic Jews organizing to ransom Ashkenazic Jews. Right? Sephardic Jews are Jews whose roots are in Spain, medieval Spain, right? And they continue to speak Jewish Spanish, Ladino, and they have their own culture, which is quite different from the Ashkenazic Jews who come from medieval Germany, and they speak Yiddish and they have their own culture, which is quite different. They don't even speak the same language. They're all Jews, obviously, but they have different customs and they don't speak the same language. So even though Sephardic philanthropy is generally just for Sephardim, and Ashkenazim have to rely on Ashkenazic philanthropy, at this moment, the Sephardic Jews of Istanbul begin to organize in order to redeem the Polish Jewish captives who are arriving in Istanbul in their thousands. That's a big deal because the price of slaves is high. The price of captives is high in Istanbul. That's 150,000 rial, which is a huge amount of money. It's a year's wages, more than a year's wages. It's a lot of money. The first thing that needs to happen in Istanbul is you have to get the whole mass of slaves. Of course, they're not all Jewish. In fact, the majority aren't Jewish, right? The Tatars have been slaving before 1648. They'll be slaving after 1648. The Jews are just part of the people coming. So the first thing they have to do is work out which of the slaves are Jewish. And I have a wonderful source. It's actually a literary source rather than a first-hand testimony. But it tells of the rabbis, the gabbis, in fact, in Istanbul, who go to the slave market and have to work out which are the Jews and which aren't, right? Because they're all dressed in tatters. They all look the same. The men have all got long beards. The women all look much the same, unkempt and miserable. And so this story says that they find it very difficult to identify the Jews. Initially, they're looking for Jews because they think Jews are modest people, Jews are merciful people, and Jews are charitable people, and they try to find the modest, merciful, and charitable amongst the slaves, which doesn't prove to be a very successful strategy at all. Instead, they look for Jews who can recite the Psalms. If you know the Psalms and you know the prayers, then the Jewish. And so they go around asking the captives of various sorts. And of course, non-Jewish captives have a great interest in being lined up with the Jews because they'd like to be ransomed as well. But anyway, so Interestingly, it doesn't say how they identified Jewish women captives. I'd love to have a source about that, but I don't have one. I imagine you would ask me if they could say the bracha over the Friday night candles or something of that sort to identify the women. But the source, like so many sources, it's very male-oriented, very patriarchal, and the women are passed over in silence. Once the Jews have been identified, they need to be ransomed, and the Jews of Istanbul is a big community. It's a rich community, but this is well beyond their means. Right? They begin really to have this huge philanthropic drive, which begins in 1648 and lasts for over a decade, where all available funds are being channeled into ransoming. To the extent that we do have a source about the Istanbul Jewish women who would sell their jewelry, right, in order to raise money to ransom the Polish Jews who are coming in. It's not enough, right? You have between 4,000 and 6,000 Jews, each of whom needs 150,000 real. You're talking about vast sums of money. And so what do the Jews of Istanbul do? They decide that they need to exploit the already existing philanthropic network, the network of Pidyon Shvuim. And so they have their own representative, a young man by the name of David Carcassonne, whom they send. They sent him to Venice, right, with letters, explaining just how miserable the situation was in Istanbul, just how many refugees were coming and how much help was needed. The Venetian rabbis are very sympathetic, right? They too recognize the importance of redeeming these Polish Jewish captives. And in fact, they help Carcassonne travel around the Sephardic communities. In Italy, we'll see a map in a minute, up to Hamburg and Amsterdam, travel around to raise money so that he is able to come back and raise some money to help them. He actually travels around, it takes him 2 years, his travel around Europe to raise money. He raises a not inconsiderable amount of money, but in terms of what's needed, it's a drop in the bucket, it's a drop in the ocean. Probably less than 20 slaves, the ransom for less than 20 slaves. But that's what he gets. I mean, it's a problem. He spent 2 years away from home. His expenses have to be covered. So a lot of the money he's raising is going to cover his expenses for raising money. And it's not a very successful, in the end, it's not a very successful fundraising deal. He goes back to Istanbul with the money. The Istanbul Jews more and more come to realize that they can only rely on themselves. They send other emissaries out later on, but they can really only rely on themselves. They're very angry though. They are very angry with the Jews of Venice. And I have a letter, if I can find it, here. A letter they wrote in 1656 when they sent out another emissary. And the letter says to the Jews of Mantua from the Jews of Istanbul, "You gentlemen obviously know about the great disaster that befell our brothers in Ukraine, which was why we sent a special emissary to Italy a little while back. The efforts he invested were huge, the results tiny. We had expected that our Italian brothers would act honorably and make a significant contribution, one worthy of the problem, which was extremely serious. What they actually gave was no more than a drop in the ocean." I actually managed to find a copy of the original letter in the script of the Turkish Jews and the beautiful signatures that they have. It has, to my eye, a very Oriental look to it, but that's just me. At any rate, the Jews, it's not that the Jews of Italy aren't giving money and the Jews of Amsterdam and Hamburg aren't, because they do give money. Every town that Carcassonne went to and the other emissaries that came after, they all got a certain amount of money. It just wasn't a huge amount of money. And there was a reason for that. Because these communities were also supporting Polish Jews in other ways. So, for example, the communities in Poland, the communities that have been destroyed, they send out emissaries, right, to the communities of Europe, in particular Italy, which is quite well connected with Poland, with begging letters saying our community is destroyed, we have to rebuild our lives, please give us money, please give us money. And the communities give them money. Another thing that happens is you have individuals, some who've just fled, they're just refugees who fled on foot across Europe. Some go to Amsterdam and then by ship to Livorno, others just flee and find themselves in Italy. They too go round and ask for money from community to community. Right? And we have records of these communities, that time after time, Polish Jews are turning up. There's one great exchange of letters between, I can't remember where it is now, Ancona and Venice. Because Venice gets upset with the Jews of Ancona, they're not sending money to Venice. And the Jews of Ancona to ransom the Polish Jews in Istanbul. And the Jews in Ancona write back and say, well, you know, you can talk. We have Polish Jews here coming all the time and we're giving them money every time. Right? We haven't got any money left to send to you. We're doing it our own thing. Venice tried to organize the communities together. It wanted to set up a proper network. Of course, it wanted to be in the center. It wanted to run the show so that it could collect money centrally and direct it. The pressures were too great in 1648. But it does begin as time moves on, the collecting becomes more and more organized. And what's happened in 1648 is the beginning of that process of bringing these philanthropic enterprises together. The other thing that these Jews do is they ransom slaves themselves. Many slaves from the Ottoman Empire who've been redeemed have left family members and friends behind. And so they come to Italy, right, and they're trying to raise money to ransom their connections still in the slave markets. Some Jews come from Poland itself. Say, you know, my wife has been taken and I need to ransom her, and they go around and collect money too. So these Jews, these Sephardic Jews, are being as generous as they can with the Polish Jews. Of course, it's never enough money. Right? There's always a huge shortfall. But these communities are putting their hands in their pockets time after time after time. And that's without even mentioning the fact that there are still captives on Malta that need to be ransomed, Sephardic captives that need to be ransomed. And they have to contribute to that too. So ransoming in the wake of 1648 becomes big, big business in the Mediterranean. We also are aware of fraud, right? Not everyone treated this piously. We have people forging letters, you know, to get money that's, you know, by fraudulent means. We have people engaging in identity theft, pretending to be somebody else in order to raise money. So it's like in all situations when there's a lot of money floating around, there's also a certain amount of crime, and the Jews were not free of that either. So what we've seen is that this crisis has actually begun to connect together Jewish communities that would have had little or no connection before. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, right? And as I say, even in one case, Fez. I have another case of false pretenses in Fez, but that's a different story. The Jewish world is becoming smaller. These Polish Jews and the pressure that they've brought on the Jewish world is making the Jewish world smaller. It's all becoming more interconnected. Right? It's nothing like the modern Jewish world, right? We're talking about the very first step towards our interconnected world. But this is, I think, the first major step in that direction. So how does it play out? Well, we have all these Jews ransomed in Istanbul. And from the few sources I have, it seems to me that of the 4,000 to 6,000 Jews that are ransomed, sold there, almost all the Jews are ransomed. We have non-Jewish sources saying that the Jews have not left anyone behind. I can't tell you whether it's actually true or not, but in my estimation, it's basically true. The Jews, it took them 15 years, right? So once again, you're in the mid-60s, but by the mid-60s, the Jewish refugees have been ransomed. What do? Well, many of them don't want to stay in Asia Minor. They're not made members of communities straight away. They remain outsiders. And so they work, the men at least, work as they can, earn money, and return home. It's a long and dangerous trip, and the war is still going on. And we have a lot of evidence of men that are going back through what we call today Romania back into Poland. One or two women do, but most of the women don't. Right? These women are separated from their husbands, they're separated from their family, they find themselves in a new place. It's too dangerous. So the women tend, once again, I'm generalizing on the basis of very little evidence, but for evidence I have, the women tend to stay put. Now, if they want to stay put, they have one big problem to solve. Right? They cannot remarry until they either have a solid evidence that their husband is dead and they are widows, or they have a divorce document, a get. Right? And obviously in this war situation, both of those things are very difficult. I have one wonderful story of Jewish women in Cairo who've heard their husbands are still alive. And so they hire an agent, send him to Poland. He travels around. He gets the gittin that the women want, brings them back to Cairo. That's an unbelievable story. And in fact, the rabbi in Cairo didn't believe it either. So that's why we have a court case, right? We have a ruling about the status of these documents. That's how we know about the story. Other women tried to do the other thing. They wanted to prove that their husbands were dead. And to do that, they needed evidence from Eastern Europe. They needed witness evidence. And so what I discovered was that wherever people with news of Eastern Europe sort of turned up in a Jewish community, the local men, and in particular the local women, would drag them to the rabbinic court, have them give a testimony about what they'd seen, who they'd seen killed, and so on. And then that could be sent around to people who needed it. It's a kind of information network serving the Jewish women. And in fact, to a great extent, I believe, organized by the Jewish women. So most of the Jewish men have gone back by the mid-60s. Most of the Jewish women are staying in place. That means that there's not a big change in terms of the sort of Jewish ethnic build-up makeup of the Ottoman Empire. It's not like you suddenly have a big Ashkenazi community here. That doesn't happen because the men have gone home and the women, to the great extent, will take on the cultural attributes of their husbands. But nonetheless, as we saw in Lithuania, by the time you get to the mid-60s, this is a problem that has been solved. Okay, the very last piece of the story is going home. I'll do this quickly because I'm running out of time. The reconstruction. Coming back to Poland in general and to Ukraine in particular was coming back to a destroyed country. Or the life that you'd known was gone. You were starting afresh. But what we see is that the Jews are very active at rebuilding. The first thing that they do, they'll come back to town, they'll try to identify property that belonged to them and take it over. And within a very short time, they will set up Jewish communities to run Jewish life. And within a very short time, right, they will resume business. But they have to, they need to survive. It turns out that this actually, the speed by which they do this gives them an advantage in the local economy because their non-Jewish neighbors, all of whom have gardens and agricultural land, even if they lived in towns, they would sort of use that land to support themselves. They'd have their own, they'd leave the urban occupations and rely on agriculture to survive, which meant that the urban economy was open to the Jews. And so the Jews could actually, because they were so good at reorganizing and restarting their economic activity, they were able to take on stronger positions than they'd had before the uprising. It's another one of the remarkable phenomena of this moment, right? That the Jews in Poland, they don't just sort of survive, they bounce back, and they bounce back strongly. Another phenomenon that we see in this period, which is also extremely interesting, is that Jews will take non-Jews to court in order to get their property back. When the Jews fled, right, sometimes they had treasure, or they had some property, they would bury it. Sometimes they'd give it to non-Jewish neighbors. Of course, when they came back, right, sometimes the property they buried had gone, or the non-Jewish neighbors wouldn't return their property. And so the Jews took them to court. Right? The Jews were active in using the courts to return their property and to bring people who'd murdered Jews, right, to trial, right, to justice. That was called taking vengeance, nekama, in the language of the time. And once again, it's a sign of just how proactive these Jews are. Right? They're using the non-Jewish courts, right, to get justice for the dead as much as they can, and to get back their property if it had been lost. So once again, it's this, there's this dynamism of these people coming back to rebuild their lives. The last thing I really want to talk about is spiritually. Actually, I'll speak about, after spiritual, I'll speak about psychological first. The penultimate thing I want to speak about, and then I'll finish the lecture. But this is a major blow to Jewish life, right? A third of the population is dead, communities are destroyed, it's being rebuilt. There are a lot of very traumatized people, particularly in Ukraine, but not just there, across Poland. And the Jewish community is not just aware of this, right? It actually wants to deal with the problem of traumatized people. And it does it, it's actually a time-honored Jewish custom, which is really interesting, but it does it by setting up a sort of a particular memorial day for the Jews who've been killed. It's on the month of Sivan, the 20th of Sivan. That is the day in which the first of the big Jewish communities was destroyed by the Cossacks. It had been a fast in the Middle Ages for different reasons, so there was kind of continuity as well. What's the importance of this? What do I see as the importance of this? This is a day where it was a fast day, where the community stops, people go to shul, they go to the synagogue, they say memorial prayers for the dead, prayers that have been specially written for the occasion. I mean, we have a great deal of liturgical material that's been written for this. And they say the El Mali Rachamim to mention the names of the dead. What you can see here is a very, very poor picture, but it's actually a 17th century list of the Jews who were killed in the community of Narol. And to the best of my understanding, this was the list that would have been read out in the shul in Narol with the names of the people of the community who were killed in 1648. Why is it so important? It's important because it allows the traumatized Jews to reintegrate their lives. Like, what happened to them? That whole trauma of becoming a refugee and fleeing, seeing all the murder, the violence and the suffering, right? It's not all pathological. They don't all have PTSD, as we say today, but they all carry with them a burden of trauma, more or less heavy. The 20th of Sivan is a moment where they can revisit that, right, as a part of their lives. It's not a moment of destruction of their lives. 20th of Sivan is a part of the liturgical calendar. It's a part of reintegration. And they remember the dead. And they have prayers for the dead. And interestingly, these prayers also talk about nekama, right? They want God to bring vengeance for them. So they have vengeance in the courts and they have vengeance in the synagogue. They're working through those feelings. They're the dark feelings, right? You want vengeance. But the Jews are sublimating them in a religious way. And so this fast, in fact, in my understanding, allows the Jews to contain their trauma, to work through their trauma. I mean, not all Jews, some of the trauma can't be done. But I believe for the most of the Jews, they are able to reintegrate their lives together. And they do it using this fast of the 20th of Sivan. And that, I think, is the key to understanding the whole success of this refugee crisis, how it was dealt with. And I think I would look at it in sort of three things: reintegration. Right? The Jews are integrated. They're not left floating. They're integrated socially. They're integrated after the war. Right? They're integrated economically and spiritually. They're reintegrated. Their lives become whole again. The refugees are given agency. Right? We saw that in Schwalb, right? Where they weren't treated as refugees. They were given the choice to work. They could work and support themselves. The Jews in Istanbul, once they'd been ransomed, they would work, earn money, because they wanted to go home. They took their lives in their own hands. They had agency. The lack of agency is one of the major problems we have in dealing with refugees today. We put them all in huge refugee camps, and they're dependent on philanthropy. Well, there was philanthropy for the Jews, but it wasn't the end of the story. Right? Those Jews were given agency. Their lives were in their own hands. And finally, on a whole number of different levels, their lives are given meaning. They're given meaning because the philanthropy that is done is part of the Jewish commandment. These are mitzvot. Jews helping Jews, they are fulfilling a commandment. It has a meaning, both for the people who are giving and for the people who are receiving. And it's not a small meaning, it's a major meaning. If you look at the 20th of Sivan and various other things I haven't talked about, there's also an attempt to give it spiritual meaning. The suffering of the Jews has meaning because these Jews are part of a longer continuum of Jewish suffering. I remember I said 20th of Sivan had been a fast in the Middle Ages. That's exactly this idea. There's a continuum of Jewish suffering. So what we're suffering, I mean, it's our suffering, it happened to us, but it's part of the Jewish story. It's part of the stories of the Jews. We are, again, integrated. The beautiful story of that is the Rabbi of Krakow, who was asked by his congregants to make a special prayer for the dead and for the refugees. And he starts off and says to his congregants, I don't need to say a special prayer. We've got plenty of prayers. Now, why should I write a special prayer? We'll use one of the existing ones. And his congregants get very upset. And they say, absolutely not. We want you to write a special prayer. So then he takes a medieval prayer and sort of reworks it, adds a bit and reworks it. And his Jewish congregants are not interested in that either. They said, we want a prayer for us. And so the rabbi at the end writes a prayer, but he calls it Ele Ezkara. Ele Ezkara is one of the major Jewish prayers of Yom Kippur, talking about Jewish martyrdom. So the Jews' suffering, though it's theirs, and it's important that it's theirs, puts them in a kind of suffering, in a kind of continuum of the Jews' relationship with God. They're not abandoned by God. What they've gone through is part of God's story, God's relationship with the Jewish people. And that gives them meaning. So on those three levels, reintegration, agency, and meaning, the Jewish community is able to overcome all of the different traumas I've talked about. And the movement of the Jews across the world have been, as I say, 15 or 20 years, which in real time is a long time, but in historical terms, it's a really relatively short time. They are able to either settle where they are or return home and rebuild their lives. That, I think, is a really major success story in Jewish history. Okay, that's the lecture. I've gone on over a bit, I'm sorry. A few minutes over time.
It's perfectly all right. It was fascinating. Your expertise in economic, social, and cultural history really lend such a richness to this narrative. It's not just a story of conflict. This is a story of humanity that you're telling.
Hopefully.
I wanted to open up to some questions that are coming in and add a little bit of my own to it. I'd like to begin by asking, it's so fascinating that you identify this as sort of a successful reintegration. And I wanted to push back on that a little bit.
Cool.
In the sense that the refugees have agency, which seems to be sharply delineated by gender here, that the men are returning and the women are integrating into the societies in which they arrived as refugees. And so one of the questions that came in is, why would people choose to go back to a land where they had encountered so much suffering? And perhaps we're looking at that through a modern lens, but it would be fascinating to hear your response on that. And I wonder if you would also sort of comment on how you see the agency of men and women differently in these two outcomes.
So first of all, there was a movement of rabbis who said that the Jews shouldn't go back to Ukraine. There'd been a sort of, I think it was actually an urban legend, but there'd been a sort of story that the Jews were, there was a cherem on the Jews going back to Spain after the expulsion. So there was an attempt to do that here. And it didn't work. The Jews wanted to go back. For the Jews of Poland, they loved their home. They called Poland, Greater Poland, which is Ukraine and Lithuania, Polania, that's it's called in Hebrew, and that means Polania. Here God rests. This was a holy place. Right? And they didn't want to leave. They'd had a flourishing community before 1648. They'd been the Torah study center of definitely the Ashkenazi world and possibly the world in general. And they loved it, and this was their home, and they wanted to go back. They didn't want to stay. So that is for the men. The women's a whole different story. The women going back put them into a very difficult situation. First of all, would their husbands take them back? Because there would always be a suspicion either that they'd converted or that they'd slept with their captors. And so even if they go back home, right, a man goes back home, he takes his place in the community and gets on with his life. A woman goes back home, right? She's faced with this wall of suspicion and hostility. Of course, women did go back, but it was, it was a major issue. Now, did that mean that they lost their agency? Well, I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, to the extent that Jewish women had agency, I mean, it wasn't a big thing for Jewish women in general to have agency in this period, right? However, these women, I tried to sort of pull it out, but in terms of the economics, while they were being refugees, their organization in order to get their status sorted out if they were in the Ottoman Empire, suggests to me that they are not without agency, quite the reverse. They are, in fact, an important part of what's going on in the refugee world.
That's absolutely fascinating, the discussion of the gets.
Yes.
Clearly, there's tremendous agency on these women's part.
Right.
You're searching out through these sources. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the enormous range of sources that you studied for this work.
Yeah, well, okay, so I mentioned two of them. I mentioned the sort of little rabbinic autobiographical vignettes in the introductions to their books, and the depositions, often transcribed in Yiddish, in the original Yiddish, which is lovely. What else did I see? I had community record books I used. I had fundraising and other correspondence of the rabbis in Venice in particular, but also in Mantua. So I had all that material. Certain amount of non-Jewish sources. I talked about the town of Slutsk in Lithuania. So I was using records from the town council there. Didn't talk about it, but I had records from Vienna. And all kind, I mean, even the press, I mean, there's not much 17th century press, but here and there, I managed to find details about Jewish refugees in the German press and in other places. Most fun sources, however, were the Yiddish sources, which I mentioned only one. I had about half a dozen. These are mostly literary. They're not sort of reportage. But these are how Jews talked about. You got a sense of the Yiddish-speaking Jewish street, what they thought about the refugees. So I had this great narrative of the Polish Jews being taken as Jewish women, being taken as slaves to Istanbul. I had a wonderful poem, a satirical poem, about an argument between a Polish Jewish refugee and a German, I didn't talk about Germany, but a German Jewish householder, right? Satirical poem about the meeting of these two people and what they thought about each other. It's described as a cat and mouse game. Those sources are really wonderful because you get a real sense, it gives you the texture, not just what happened, but you get a feeling, what people are thinking, what people are feeling. The rest of it was just whatever I could find. All kinds of different languages, material. It had some in Dutch, I had some in Czech. I found one Tatar chronicle of slaving, which mentions the Jews in one place. It was a real mosaic. I say in the book, the sources are in 12 languages. I don't know 12 languages. I had a lot of help. It was a book that I needed a lot of help with. I guess I know perhaps 6 of them, but the other 6 I didn't, and so I had a lot of help doing that. Which meant it's actually an act of chutzpah writing this book, because I'm writing stuff I don't. But I said to myself, I can see the picture. So even if I don't have complete control of everything, I'll write the picture. And if someone wants to correct me on one detail or another, be my guest. Sorry, I've gone on and on. What else did you, another question?
No. This is absolutely fascinating. I've heard over and over from people that they knew about these incidents, but to compile all these sources and amass it into a single narrative is a tremendous work of art, really, that you've done here. I wonder if you wouldn't mind, because we are running out of time, just in closing, to speak a little bit about, through all the study that you've done on this book, and of course I encourage everybody to read it, and we'll follow up this talk with the information for you to be able to get this wonderful book. But I wonder if you wouldn't give us a little perspective on the process of researching and writing and immersing yourself in this world, sort of what your thoughts are on what we can learn from this period of time and reflect on in terms of the global refugee crisis today.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I did when I was sort of working on the book was to try to understand current conceptions of refugees, which is today they call it forced migration, which is why. And I read quite a good deal of material about that. One book in particular, I'm just going to share the screen for a very brief minute and show you the book because it's important. Oh, come on. This book. Richard Molliker is the head of the Refugee Trauma Center in Harvard, and he wrote this book, Healing Invisible Wounds, Paths to Hope and Recovery in a Violent World. And he has a theory, right, on the basis of decades of research into current problems of refugees, about the needs of refugees in order to overcome refugee crises. And it was very influential in how I read my sources. So a lot of what I said at the end, allowing refugees to solve their problems through their own culture, rather than having an NGO or another country imposing on the refugees cultural conceptions that are foreign to the refugees need to work it through in their own culture. And Molliker talks also about religion and spirituality, right? He says that we in the West, certainly those kind of organizations, they're very secular, they're interested in practical issues, and they sort of poo-poo religious ideas as unimportant. And Molliker says absolutely the reverse. If these refugees can give themselves meaning, right, that is a key element in what he calls self-healing. And the questions of agency, the questions of economic activity, right? These are all elements that Molliker has identified, but what he couldn't do, I mean, I'm not setting myself up against Molliker. He's a major figure in the field of forced migration studies, but the beauty of this project, in its modest way, is that I have a whole crisis. I have a crisis from beginning to end in its different stages. The immediate flight. There's a second stage of organized flight. Then I have the meetings of the Jews in, the refugees and the settled Jews in Poland, the refugees and the settled Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and the refugees and the Jews in the German land, which I didn't talk about here. So I can examine those meetings, what they meant, how they worked. And that gives me a clearer sense of how the crisis was solved, which you can't do with the current refugee crisis because they're ongoing. I mean, it's a non-stop problem. And I think the ability to take that perspective, to look at the suffering in the language of the people doing the suffering. That's why I love this book, because I have so many first-hand sources. You can hear the voices of the people telling us what they went through. And so you can study this on a personal level. It's also not 100,000 refugees here or 200,000 refugees there. I have tens of thousands of refugees, which is a lot for the 17th century. But I have individuals. You can hear individual experience. And I don't think you can understand refugee crises if you don't really look at that. So it's the perspective of history that allows me, I hope, to give these scholars a kind of perspective they might not get from their very, very intensive and very, very important current work. And they can see how various strategies played out in the past with what levels of success on one level or another. So, this is my hope as an author, right? That there will be people in that field to whom this book will speak, and it will add something to their armory as they consider the very problematic issues of refugees in our world.
I hope it also contributes to work on examining resettlement after, for example, World War II, that there's actually been, a gap really in the literature at looking at what you're talking about of sort of the recovering the emotional trauma and how that's been addressed. So you open the door to many sort of areas of emerging scholarship.
Yeah, I think the important thing there that I would say is there has been work done on psychologically traumatized people, second generations, been done. But the more prosaic daily issues, and perhaps the less traumatized people, and that hasn't been looked at. You're absolutely right. So I'm not trying to do the pathological work. I can't. You can't do pathological analysis of Jews 300 years ago. It's just impossible. But the idea of looking at the other elements of life, meanings and constructions and agency and and rebuilding, those are key questions. I think actually there's work to be done not just on post-World War II, that's very, very important, but Jewish history in general. I mean, there are various points in Jewish history, these major crises, and time after time, the Jews have managed to overcome them and rebuild. We haven't been wiped out, right? We have this huge history because we're still here. Well, we shouldn't take it for granted. We're still here because we have strategies that allow us to overcome these kind of crises. And the Holocaust, the greatest of all. I mean, you might have expected, even if Jews remained alive, that the Jewish would just disintegrate after such a trauma. But no. An amazing, like I said, the bouncing back. Well, you look 50 years after the Holocaust, look at the Jewish world that was. You have the state of Israel, a regional power, economic powerhouse, right? Social engineering, astonishing. You have American Jewry, right? Playing these kind of major roles in American society, creating new forms of Jewish culture. That's only decades after the Holocaust. And we take it for granted. It's the world we live in. We grew up in this world. But you shouldn't. It's an absolute miracle, that within such a short time, the Jewish people could do that. And it's the experience of centuries, including what I talked about, but I think there are other cases too.
That's wonderful. Well, that's a perfect tie-in to, of course, the whole mission of the Schwalb Center. So we're so enormously grateful for you to join us tonight and share some knowledge about your book. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful,
I had a wonderful time.
lecture. Yes.
Okay.
All right. With that, we will say good night. And I want to mention to everyone who's still with us, that there will be a recording of the talk available on the Schwalb Center website within the next 2 days. So if you know people who weren't able to join us tonight, you can refer them to the Schwalb Center site. And with that, we'll say good evening. Thank you all very much.